everyone, welcome back to another video. So today I kind of wanted to answer the question for you guys, like how to blind pick or what is a good blind pick? Because I get asked this all the time on stream and it's very easy to kind of link one of my previous blind pick tier lists, and I probably will make a new one eventually, but that doesn't really tell the full story because there's a lot of different things to blind pick, and obviously a lot of you guys are going to have different champions in your pools. So it's not always going to be as simple as just choosing, let's say one or two of the best blinds. You might just have to make do with what you have. So we're really going to break down, what makes a good blind pick, examples of good blinds, and other things you can consider. So the big question then, what makes a good blind? To be honest, what makes a good blind is actually quite simple. It's the ability to have impact on the game or have a lot of impact on the outcome of the game despite picking first. And there's a lot of different ways to do this, right? Like you can have impact by just playing an OP champ. You can have impact by playing a champ that will scale in spite of the laning phase. You can have impact from a champion that can push and roam and neutralize the laning phase, right? There's a lot of different ways to have impact. I'll go into a little bit what are kind of bad examples of blinds, but let's go over a few good ones first. So one easy way to blind pick is just by picking the power pick. So if you go and have a look at my latest mid lane tier list for the patch and just pick, kind of champs that are very high on the list. So things like Aurora or Galio are just generally OP champs. So even if they get countered, chances are you're going to have a lot of impact anyway, right? Like both these champs have counters. Aurora kind of struggles against longer range mages. Galio can definitely struggle against ADCs, but it's very hard to make these champions useless just because they are so OP. So that is just one way you can pick. It's just picking the most OP champs. Another way to blind pick is by picking a neutralizer. So neutralizers can be things that have like high mobility, high sustain, high wave clear, basically just ways to make sure that they don't get demolished by the enemy mid. And so good examples of stuff like that would be Ahri. Ahri has all those things, lots of sustain, lots of mobility, lots of wave clear. There's some other ones like Lux, for example, has a ton of range and the ability to pretty much neutralize any wave post 6. There's some other super sustained demons like the Cho'Gath mid that I talked about in my tier list. Not sure if he's even listed on here. But yeah, even something like Garen, right? Like things that have just so much sustain that they can't be pushed out of lane. So even if you're counterpicked, most likely you're still going to be able to have quite a lot of CS. You can also go for strong laning champs that also scale. It's kind of important that they also scale because if you just pick a strong laning champ that falls off, like something like Pantheon, if you can't manage to find that snowball, then you're probably not going to have a whole lot of impact on the game. But something like Orianna or Azir, champions that are kind of known for a strong laning phase that also scale reasonably well are generally going to be, solid blinds. The risk of champions like maybe Ori or Victor with these are that they are immobile, and we'll kind of talk about mobility as we go on with some more specific scenarios. But generally these are going to be pretty good because even if you get counterpicked, it's likely that you'll be able to have at least decent impact. The last way of picking is with flex picks. So it's a bonus if your flex pick also happens to be very powerful. So examples of power picks that are also flexes right now would be something like Aurora and Jace. Both these champs are probably strong enough just to blind pick even if they weren't flexes, but the added bonus of them both being mid-top flexes is really, really valuable. There are some things that are slightly less powerful, but maybe more powerful in the actual flex department. So an example of that would be something like Karma or Corki. So like you expect Corki when picked to be AD carry, and you expect Karma when picked to be support. They can go mid or maybe even top, but it's not as likely, right? So it's chances are that when they're picking, they're not going to be directly countering you. Whereas like with Aurora, it's like, yeah, this can go top, maybe they'll respect it, but a lot of the time they'll probably just pick as if it's Aurora mid. It is important that if you do decide to flex something that's like sort of off meta or weird, like let's say you're flexing like Tryndamere or Cho'Gath or something, try and make sure that your flex pick is good against the mid lane blinds, right? Because you don't want it to be the case of like, okay, my opponent they're picking as if they're blind picking, but their blind picks, again, the common ones being, let's say something like Aurora. If Aurora is good against your flex pick, then you didn't really get any value out of it, right? Because despite the fact that you tried to trick them, you still ended up with a bad matchup. I've listed a lot of champions, so you guys might be wondering then, what is a bad blind pick? And for me, like bad blind picks generally have like 3 big things to them. First one, and probably the biggest one, is being weak in lane. It's very, very risky to blind a champion that's weak in lane because there's a lot of champions in League that are strong in lane and scale. For example, if you pick something like Veigar, right? Like this is a champ that is kind of weak in lane, but is meant to scale, especially into like melee compositions, right? The problem is, if you blind pick Veigar and you get counterpicked by something like Syndra, not only are you going to lose lane, you're going to get outscaled, you can get punished for your immobility by Syndra's gank setup, and you get outranged in team fights. So you basically have no win condition. You're just losing on all fronts. So that would make something like Veigar more of a counterpick. Immobility in general, that's kind of the second one. Immobility is normally bad for a blind pick. Now, you can kind of make up for it. For example, like Orianna can run Phase Rush, right? So that makes her like a little less bad of a blind. There might also be various builds, like for example, actually using Ori is another good example. Like Ori's standard build at the moment is probably to build Seraph's Liandry. So despite being immobile, she's actually quite tanky. If you compare that to something like, I don't know, or actually, another good example that I can think of would be Hui. So even though Hui is somewhat immobile, he has like reasonable self-peel, he has like a lot of range. So like immobility can be an issue depending on like how short range you are, how vulnerable you are, and also depending on what champs the enemy team has picked. So generally try and blind pick something with mobility, but if you blind pick something immobile, you can make it work. It just kind of depends. And the last one to be really careful of is playing a champion that needs to snowball. So an example would be something like Qiyana. Like in my mind, Qiyana is both weak in lane and needs to snowball. So that makes it like really, really difficult to blind because it's like, you know, you basically have to try and have, you know, some sort of impact in early skirmishes, but it's much harder to do that if you're like really hard losing 1v1. You don't have a window to like ever leave without like giving up a whole lot. So a champion like Qiyana, I would say, is much, much better as a counter pick. Because again, like the combination of being weak in lane plus needing to snowball is very, very punishing if you can't find that. One last thing I want to add before we move on to the next section is that somewhat blind picks can depend a little bit on elo. And what I mean by that is there are certain champions in lower elo that people find really, really hard to punish. And examples of that would be things like Malzahar or Anivia. So these champions, well, Anivia is very weak pre-6, and a lot of the time you can have this huge lead over Anivia to the point where once she reaches 6, she's not as much of a neutralizer as she should be. Mouse is also a good example, right? Like Mouse, when he gets chapter and if he's like level 7 or whatever, is really, really hard to punish at this point if you're even. But you should be able to build a really, really big lead over Malzahar before that to where he never really reaches that point without already being extremely far behind. So champs like Mouse and Anivia and high elo are probably really bad blind picks because they're weak in lane and they're very punishable. But I think you'd actually find that in elos below maybe, I don't know, let's say Emerald, that Anivia and Malzahar are actually probably very good blinds because they are quite uninteractive and do reach their wave clear reasonably early if not punished. So for the second part of this video, I'm going to get into some of the more advanced or more niche cases when it comes to drafting. And to explain that, first we kind of have to talk about how champ select normally works in solo queue, at least in higher elos. Now this doesn't happen every time, but something you guys might have noticed is just the general kind of pick hierarchy or pick order for the roles. So what will normally happen is that you'll see like AD is typically the most blindable, right? So a lot of the time you'll see AD picked here. This can be whatever. Don't worry about the champs, just worry about the roles. This will normally be answered by an AD of some kind and then a jungler, because normally junglers are also quite blindable. And then so on this side, now back on blue side, we'll probably counterpick with jungle. And then this is one of the first contested picks. Normally this will be support, but sometimes it'll be mid if the support's really greedy. But let's just say it's support. Again, do not worry so much about the champions I'm putting on the screen at the moment. That'll then be matched by support over here. Just put in some random shit. And then coming down to the kind of fourth and fifth pick, this is where normally the top laners, it's kind of agreed upon, get the last pick, right? So normally if you're red side, you're going to be blind picking with your top laner last picking. So what does that mean? That means on red side, if you play a flex pick that flexes with top, it's much more valuable than on the other side. So for example, if we pick Jace here, this is quite valuable, right? Because that could just as well be the top laner. And this guy's going to have to pick, you know, thinking it is. He might pick something like Aurelia, which is very counterable by your top lane. So like the flex pick on this side is quite valuable. If you were to do the same thing on this side, it's not as valuable, right? Because if you pick Jace here, the enemy top laner is going to get to see who he's against anyway. So the top lane flex pick is not as valuable on blue side. That being said, on blue side, most of the time, you're going to be counterpicking, right? Because if everything plays out the way it should, this will be the mid laner, and then you can counterpick it. Another thing you might want to think about is the support counter, or the support flex. So like a support flex on this side is only really useful if you take it third, right? Because like if we take Karma here, or she's not even listed in the mids, but if we took Karma here, for example, right? It's like they already see the Nautilus. Like it doesn't really help unless we're willing to pick Karma here. So basically just what I'm saying is like with the flex picks, you have to think a little bit about like how solo queue normally plays out, and whether or not people are going to like reveal their picks. Because again, let's say, for example, that we take our top laner here, this is still kind of like useful for our top laner, right? Because most likely he will get to counter, but you are still going to get countered mid. Whereas again, if you take your top lane flex here instead, they don't know for sure if that's going mid or top. So basically, just the TLDR of it is that flex picks are typically in solo queue going to be much more valuable on red side, unless you're playing a support you're playing a mid that flexes with support or something, in which case that's actually going to be more valuable on blue side for the most part. Another thing worth noting here is that because the mid laner picks late in the draft, you're not like truly blind picking with zero information, right? Like that would be if you're like blue side first pick, that's picking without any other info. No idea what your teammate's playing, no idea what they're playing either. But the thing is, like as a mid laner, again, since we're picking kind of late in the draft and solo queue, you're going to see a lot of your teammates' picks. So for example, there are some champions, normally with gang setup or normally the champs that want to fight, they can be kind of risky blinds in isolation, but are actually quite good if the right champions are shown. So for example, champ like LeBlanc probably don't want to first pick blind pick this, because LeBlanc is a champ that gets a lot of value from, having teammates that can basically come mid. So if you play LeBlanc on its own and you end up playing with something like Kayn and Karma, that's not particularly threatening, right? On the other hand, if let's say our, ADC can be whatever, if this ends up being something like Jarvan and then your support ends up like Leona, it's like, well, in this spot here, we could take a bunch of champs that we wouldn't normally be able to. So for example, we could play something like LeBlanc, something even like a Kali, knowing that you're going to get a lot of help mid, or you could play something like Fizz, a champ that, again, really wants to set up ganks. You could even take like the Silas that we were talking about before. So this would be like irrespective of what their team is showing. And even though these champs are kind of like decent blinds, but maybe not great, they're made better by seeing these champs. So like you can look at your team composition, and that can sometimes enable certain champions that wouldn't necessarily be the best blind. There's also sometimes specific combos that are really, really good, right? So like we would normally say that a champion like Yasuo is not a particularly strong blind, right? Like you would not want to take Yasuo here because you're going to end up against, again, like Lissandra or LeBlanc or Akali or something that just makes your life very difficult. However, if you have like a Diana here, this makes this way more blindable. It's still not going to be like a literal S tier blind, right? Like nothing is a literal perfect blind. I guess it might be an S tier blind with Diana actually. Like if you had something like, I don't know, Diana and then like Gragas top, or maybe this ends up being like Nautilus support or something, or a Rel, a bunch of things. Basically, it's making this pick more blindable because you have a really insane comp with it. So there's tons of these different combos. Another one would be something like Galio Jarvan or Orianna Jarvan, Orianna Nocturne. There's other things like pairing Zed with Karthus or Zed with Evelynn. You could even, let's say, for example, that we had some like really strong engaged champs. That's when you could pick something greedy. Like I mentioned it in my tier list, but something that I played why is this scrolling like that? Something that I played a little bit recently was Zillion. And basically, in each time I did this, it was because I had champs on my team that I could buff. Like this time I had an Olaf AD carry with a Viego. This time I had like a Jinx plus a Viego. So even though Zillion is like a bad blind, right? I knew I was going to like go down in CS like pretty much every lane. I didn't really care because my team composition was so good. And so that's mainly caring about your team. But that also applies to the enemy team. So for example, again, even though a champion with a somewhat bad blind, like Silas, if you have something like, I don't know, let's say you have like Alistar ult here and I don't know what other really good ults you could have. You could have like, I don't know, a Mumu ult, or maybe they've blind picked Malphite or something. It's probably more likely to be on the other side. But basically, if there were like really good ultis here, or if you knew this team composition was really good, you could probably go for Silas here, even if your mid matchup wasn't necessarily going to be as good. Other examples of this is something like Taliyah. Like Taliyah's quite a greedy blind, right? Like typically just a Taliyah on its own, especially if you put it early in the draft, not going to be that good because, it's countered by range. There's a lot of bad mid matchups. But like, let's say that they've shown a lot of melee. And this is actually a very common one in solo queue at the moment, is that you'll see a lot of melee here. So you might see something like, I don't know, maybe a short range AD carry like Draven, that's quite bad against Taliyah, or a Kalista would be another one. And then they lock in some stuff here, like maybe a Xin Zhao, I don't even know what that is, Xin Zhao, and then this is like a melee support. So let's say it's something like a Rel. Like Taliyah is insane against these three champions. So even if the 4-5 here is not ideal for you, that's like pretty good, right? Because again, nothing is a perfect blind. Like even if you go one of the arguably like safer blinds, like let's say we go something like an Ahri, you're still going to get countered, right? You might not get countered as hard in like the isolated 1v1, but you could end up having lower impact on the game. And remember, that's all we're worried about. We're worried about total impact on the game, not just the laning phase. So again, like seeing certain compositions from the enemy team can also kind of change like your mind for what you're going. Some other ones I can think of is if they show really low DPS, potentially you can lock in something like a Galio here, knowing that no one can kill you. Or like, let's say, for example, that they show a bunch of AP. Like maybe that here, this is like, I don't know, where's Mel? She's not listed here. Like Mel is a champ that's played AD carry quite a lot at the moment. Is she not even on here? I don't think she's on here. Okay, let's just say this is Mel, okay? So this is a champ that's not very good at killing, you know, tankier targets, at least not until like later stages of the game. And then so if they pick that AP champ here, and then maybe they also pick Karma supports, now we're seeing like a lot of AP, not a lot of DPS. And then what if their jungler does an even more criminal sin and locks in Elise, right? Pretty unlikely, but that would be a sort of situation where Galio would go insane because like they don't have the necessary tank killers plus they're heavy AP, right? And even if this ends up being something like, I don't know, let's say this ends up being a smolder, right? Like that kind of sucks, but at the end of the day, like blind picking, you're going to get punished somehow, but at least we've counted what the enemy composition has shown so far. And ideally you would do it in combination with your team. So like, for example, let's say your team has gone, I don't know, something like Jarvan, Rakan, like this is an insane composition, right? Even if you do get countered mid, your comp's looking fucking unbeatable for solo queue, which is really, really good. And one just a little bit of advice is that generally in solo queue, the best team comps are the easiest ones where you can just like group up and press your R or group up in 5v5 are really, really good for solo queue. Things that are a bit more intricate or rely you to like poke or get picks and stuff like that are normally harder to pull off. It doesn't mean that you can't play them, especially if you have good matchups. But if you're just trying to build like the most brain dead solo queue composition, normally like big ultis like this are the way to do it. So finally, to finish this video off, I just want to talk about some of the blind pick recommendations that I have. Like if you truly just have no idea what to pick, you feel like nothing in your champion pool is really a good blind, I'm just going to read off a list of recommendations I made and kind of my reasoning for each one. So first one would be, I'll go through APs and then I'll go through ADs. So AP blind recommendations, Aurora would be the best one. I think Aurora is OP plus a flex pick, does well basically all the time, and you know, into various compositions, has mobility. So I think Aurora overall is very, very solid. I've also got Ori and Galio here. These are champs that just kind of like put good team comps together pretty much no matter what. They're both also pretty good at, like, well, in Ori's case, wins most lanes, and Galio's case can neutralize most lanes, and even the champions that counter them, I feel like, can be punished quite heavily by the comps put together. For example, you could pick something like a Victor into Ori, but you might end up against like Orianna Jarvan, which is quite bad for a Victor. And same thing with Galio, like, you know, you could end up with something like, I don't know, a Corki or a Tristana into Galio, but Galio Camille would absolutely deal well with a Tristana. So like, even though the matchups are bad, it's not the easiest to actually execute in the champion themselves. Couple other AP blinds that I wrote down. If you want to blind pick an assassin, I think the best one is probably Akali. So I think Akali, I don't even know where she is. I probably went past her. Oh yeah, Akali is probably the best neutralizing assassin and also the one that can function the most compositions. I still think Akali is better as a counter. And to be honest, every single champ in the game is better as a counter, right? But like I've been saying the whole time, like there are no perfect blinds, but I think as far as assassins, AP assassins go, Akali is one of the best. And then the last one on here, the one that I personally hate the most is probably Lux. I think Lux is all around like a pretty decent blind. You can ult waves all the time, and just not having to interact at level 6 is so OP. Plus in the mid game, she's got enough range to not really interact with a whole lot of stuff. So those would be the AP blind recommendations. For ADs, there's a couple I want to mention to begin with. Those would be Jace and Yone. So these are kind of just champions that are considered overpowered at the moment. The Jace build with the Grasp, Shojin, Manamune, Cleaver build is quite strong, and you can generally play against like most things just because you have so much health. Yone, on the other hand, really good gank setup and also really good sustain. So the thing is, I do think if possible you would counterpick Yone, but as far as AD blinds go, he's one of the better ones. There are definitely some bad matchups though, like LeBlanc's pretty annoying, Akali's pretty annoying, but ultimately he's pretty blindable because you have just so much sustain. You also build Bork, which again has sustain in it, and your gank setup means like in truly bad matchups, a lot of the time you can get bailed out by your jungler. Worst case, you can just kind of like neutralize lane, play for your Bork spike, and just play side lane. What else do I have written here? Oh yeah, I have Corki and Akshan written as well. So Corki's not bad. Like Corki is pretty good mid into most things, but he does suffer against like the strong laning mages. To be honest, everything suffers against the strong laning mages. That's not like a truly unique thing. I guess the nice thing about Corki is that you can take it very early in the draft, especially if your ADC is not swapping, and they might just think it's bot, and then you can kind of, dude, is there no Corki? Then you can kind of get away with like picking this champ, which feels kind of nice. And then Akshan, yeah, I think Akshan, even though he has some bad matchups, things like Akshan things like Syndra or Hui can be pretty difficult. I think you still manage to have like a lot of impact even in spite of that. If you get some random roams off, you can definitely pop off. And then the last one I wrote for ADs is Zed. So I think Zed as a champ also prefers to be a counter pick if possible, but he's one of the better ones because he can farm from range. He's also able to take D-Shield, and he's got a lot of different setups he can run. You know, like it is possible to just run First Strike and try play for your Eclipse spike. You can sometimes go Electrocute and like cheese kills early. You can definitely play like the Conqueror Bruiser thing, and that is kind of nice, right? Like being able to play different setups gives you the option to play against a lot of different matchups. So I think that's going to be it for this video. If you guys have any questions more about like blind picks or whatever, just let me know in the comment section below and I will try and reply. I will probably make an actual blind pick tier list at some point, but I really wanted to make this video kind of underlying the principles behind blind picking, or at least how I think you should blind, specifically in solo queue. This was not for competitive, before anyone says that it's different, because yeah, it is. And yeah, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and yeah, I'll see you guys next one.